Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about imperialism, and some of this will be review, probably a lot of it will be review for you from world history, but we're also going to add in specific things that are unique to this course and European history that you haven't probably learned about imperialism in the past. So first off, imperialism is the political and economic control of one area or country by another. So it's really, in this case, Europeans extending their power over other parts of the world. And we have talked about this already. So way back in chapter 14, we talked about how Europeans began to develop overseas empires in the Americas. So in the Americas, they focused on colonizing and making actual new settlements, whereas in places like Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, they mostly focused on establishing trading posts and relationships prior to this time period. And then in the 18th and 19th centuries, European colonies in North America and Latin America became independent, partially due to Enlightenment ideas. And so that was a little bit of a setback for Europeans, but imperialism continued in places like India, South Africa, and the East Indies. And so in the 19th century, which is what we're studying now, Europeans suddenly acquired vast colonial empires throughout the world. And there's a question here for you: what enabled Europeans to conquer such vast empires? So if you'd like to, you can pause the video and discuss that as a class. So the time period before this, before the 19th century, we mostly call Old Imperialism. So during this time, Europeans focused on trade rather than settler societies in places like Africa and Asia. Old imperialism did not impose large-scale political, economic, social, and cultural changes. So basically, Europeans were not trying to actually take over these areas and control what the people did. They just wanted access to trade. So in Africa, for example, they established trading posts on the coast. The one exception to that is South Africa, which was originally settled by the Dutch in the 1600s and then taken over by the British. And then in Asia, they focused on establishing trade monopolies, especially in the islands of Southeast Asia, like what is today Indonesia, and they were mostly there for spices and other luxury products. So to illustrate old imperialism, this is a map of Africa in 1850, and you can see the different colors represent different European possessions. And mostly, with the exception of North Africa and South Africa, they're pretty much on the coastlines, just trying to connect themselves to previous trade routes. So like, for example, West Africa, we know that Europeans were there heavily involved in the slave trade before this time period. And so that's just an example of old imperialism. In the 19th century, especially the late 19th century, Europeans switched to what we call new imperialism in Africa. So this is a map of Africa by 1914, and you can see it's completely taken over by Europeans with the exception of Liberia and Ethiopia. Liberia was established as a homeland for former slaves, so that's why it was not taken over. And then Ethiopia, you might remember Italy tried to take over Ethiopia and failed. And that's really the only example of Europeans failing to conquer a specific part of Africa. So with new imperialism, what is it? New imperialism, Europeans want to totally control all parts of their empires. So they want to have political, economic, and social control over places like Africa that they did not before. And here are some causes of new imperialism. And I know you guys have studied this information before, so I'll just try to highlight the things that I think are especially important because there's a lot of information here. So politically, colonies demonstrated world power, helped maintain the balance of power. So remember, Europeans, we talked about the Congress of Vienna and how important the balance of power was to them after the Congress of Vienna throughout the 19th century. And so if Europeans see one country in Europe gaining all these colonies, they would start to get worried, like this one country is going to become too powerful and dominate the rest. And so that led directly to the race for colonies. And so for European people, they took a great sense of pride in their country being a strong and powerful empire. So that's nationalism. And this led to intense competition and rivalry over gaining more territory and more land. All right, economic, it's pretty simple. The colonies provided raw materials. So now that Europe is quite industrialized by the end of the 19th century, the colonies provide raw materials for European factories. And then when Europeans manufacture products, this is another market in which they can sell their products. So they're going to try to sell their products to people in Africa and Asia. And in a lot of cases, they're going to prevent people in those colonies from developing their own manufacturing industries so that they're dependent on Europeans. All right, socially, social Darwinism and racism are really important to understanding how Europeans treated the people that they encountered. So social Darwinism, I'm pretty sure you guys are familiar with, but social Darwinism takes Charles Darwin's ideas of natural selection and survival of the fittest and applies them to human races. So it basically says, or is a justification for taking over other people, because it says that certain races of people are naturally inferior, others are naturally superior, and so then it's natural and okay for certain groups to dominate others. And then white man's burden we'll review on another slide in a moment. And there were also Europeans that wanted to spread Christianity, which we can look at from two viewpoints, because we can understand that some people genuinely in their hearts wanted to spread Christianity. The other viewpoint, however, is that native religion in some of these places was kind of pushed out as Christianity came in. And then technology. This is something that I would ask you to look specifically at the specific inventions, because this is something that may not have been emphasized as much in world history. It's really the second industrial revolution that allowed Europeans to go out and conquer these new places, because previously Europeans would have struggled to go into the interior of Africa, for example. But now they have improved transportation, such as steamships and railroads, improved weapons, especially gunpowder weapons, improved medicines, such as quinine for malaria, because previously when Europeans arrived for the slave trade, for example, they definitely had issues with some of the tropical diseases of Africa, and improved communication like the telegraph and the radio. So if you're going to have very large empires overseas, it is very helpful if you can communicate direct messages back and forth. And so the telegraph enabled Europeans to communicate very easily and quickly with the rulers of their colonies. Telegraph wires were laid all throughout the world, even under the oceans. And so that enabled them to have a lot more control over their colonies than they did before in places like, say, the Americas. So the white man's burden is this idea that was popularized in a poem by Kipling in 1899. So I'll ask you to pause the video. Y'all can read over the poem and discuss the message of this poem. And then there are two political cartoons, so you guys can also, again, pause the video and discuss them as a class. This poem is entitled The White Man's Burden, so you can think about, based on what you see in the image, is this cartoon supporting the idea of white man's burden, that it really is a burden? Or is it going against that and saying it's not really a burden for the white people to civilize others? And here's another cartoon. So look at this one and you guys can discuss which of the causes of new imperialism that we just went over do you see at play here? So let's look in more detail at the scramble for Africa. So as we looked at the map earlier, you saw that Europeans controlled relatively little African territory before the late 19th century. So France had some territory in northern Africa, Britain had South Africa, but other than that, they were mostly there trading. This changed in the 1880s due to a few different events. One was the revolt of the Egyptians against British influence in Egypt and over the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was especially important to the British because they called it their lifeline to India. So India was the most prosperous and important colony of Great Britain, and so they used the Suez Canal to be able to travel back and forth to India relatively quickly. And so the fact that the Egyptians revolted and threatened to take away British access to the canal, really frightened Britain. And so Britain moved very quickly to move their military into Egypt and take it over. Another event that occurred was the takeover of the Congo by King Leopold of Belgium in the 1880s. He discovered gold and diamonds in Africa, which led a lot of people to want to race there and take over territory. In the Congo, he imposed brutal forced labor, which led to the starvation and death of millions of Africans. And you see in the photograph here some of the really horrible punishments that were inflicted on the laborers in these plantations. Now, these two actions, the takeover of Egypt by the British and the takeover of the Congo by King Leopold, to us today, we probably see in a negative light. For Europeans at the time, they saw this in a negative light, but for a different reason. They saw, whoa, these countries are getting colonies rapidly. They're going to make all this money, and we're going to be left behind, is how the other Europeans at the time mostly would have seen this. And so this led directly to the scramble for Africa, which took place from about 1870 to 1890. And during this period, almost all of Africa was divided up between European powers, like the map that we looked at earlier. Now, obviously, there's such intense rivalry between European countries that this could have easily led to war. And so what Europeans decided to do was from 1884 to 1885, they met in Berlin, Germany, at the Berlin Conference and negotiated treaties of who was going to control which land. So it's important to remember that they divided this up without giving thought to things like traditional ethnic boundaries, religious groups, language groups, anything like that. It's also important to remember that there were no Africans represented at the Berlin Conference. And so by 1914, only Liberia and Ethiopia were the only independent African nations left. And this map just reviews that information again. You can see all of Africa is colonized except for those two countries. Now we're going to move to imperialism in India. So by the 18th century, Britain had defeated France in the 7 Years' War, which allowed them to gain much more control of India. Also, the Mughals, which was the Indian Empire that was already there, was in a steep decline. And so the British started conquering up regional kingdoms in India and soon took over almost all of the Indian subcontinent. One really famous example of resistance to imperialism is the Sepoy Mutiny. So the Sepoy Mutiny, you might or may not remember from world history. The Sepoys were Indians who worked as soldiers for the British. So the British are ruling this subcontinent with millions of people, and they need some help. Even though they don't want the Indians to have top positions or anything like that, they still need help keeping order and control in this very large colony. And so they employed Indian soldiers, and they're called Sepoys. The Sepoy Mutiny, you might remember, occurred when a rumor circulated among the Sepoys that their bullets were greased with cow and pig fat that they had been issued by the British. And since most of them were either Hindu or Muslim, these different animals having their fat on their bullets was religiously offensive to them. And so they used this as an opportunity to revolt against British control. And even though the British quickly stopped the rebellion, it's a good example of resistance by colonial peoples against European rule. Following the Sepoy Mutiny, direct rule was established in India, and they sent a viceroy, which is a direct representative of the monarch, which at this time was Queen Victoria. So the benefits of imperialism to India, I would say there are not many, and so these could always be viewed as both positive or negative things, depending on the point of view. A small number of Indians were educated. Now, this sounds like a good thing, but the goal of Europeans in educating any of their colonial peoples was generally just to be able to serve the government. So again, it's more expensive to keep sending people from your home country to work in the government. And so if you can recruit local people to work in the government, it's cheaper and easier. So they educated usually the upper classes. The people that were already upper class in India could get an education. And some of them even, like Gandhi is an example, studied at universities and were very highly educated. But again, the goal for the Europeans is just to have them work under European control. And then new technology also spread to India. Things like the telegraph, the railroad, and a postal service became very widespread. The costs to India are much greater. So the influx of all the manufactured goods, we know that the Industrial Revolution in Britain especially focused on textiles. So all of those cheap manufactured textiles came to India and put out of business a lot of the handmade cottage industry type textiles in India. The corrupt tax system caused many Indians to lose their land. So they went into debt over time and could not afford the new taxes and had to sell their land. Another key thing is that the British switched a lot of farmers from growing cotton to growing cotton and indigo rather than growing food. And again, that would fuel the textile industry. Cotton, of course, and then indigo, in case you don't know, is used as a dye. So like denim and that kind of thing is dyed with indigo. And then again, all the best positions in the government and military were reserved for the British. So even those Indians who were upper class and became highly educated, even a lot of times studying in British schools, never could be promoted to the top positions in the government or the military. So one of the things that you're required to know for this course is how Europeans interacted in Asia. I think we can go over it pretty quickly because a lot of this is the same information as world history, and I don't think you need to know that much detail. You just need to have a basic understanding of how Asians especially responded as Europeans came. So the first question here is previous contact with Europeans. You can pause and discuss that if you would like to. So prior to the 19th century, what kinds of things were Europeans doing in Asia? So I'm going to go over some of these key events, and you can just write down these terms or however much information you think you need. So in China, and these are all 19th century things, by the way. So in China, one key event of the 19th century is the Opium Wars, which you might remember from world history. The British began selling opium in China as a way to correct an unfavorable balance of trade. And as opium is very addictive, drugs today like heroin come from opium. Many people in China became addicted to opium. And so their government asked the British to stop selling it. The British refused, and so the Chinese took it upon themselves to try to seize shipments of opium from the British, and this led the British to attacking China, and it's the Opium Wars. The Chinese lost those wars and were forced to open up more trade to Europeans. Spheres of influence are what you see in the map on the top. So these were areas of China where Europeans had exclusive trade rights. So for example, the Orange Territory, that's a British sphere of influence. They're the only people that are allowed to trade in that region. So it's another example of encroachment by Europeans on China. And then the U.S. open door policy was the idea that China should remain open to anyone who wanted to go there. This really happened because the U.S. saw these spheres of influence being created and was worried that some of these European countries were going to colonize China, which didn't end up actually happening. And so they wanted to make sure that they would still have access to trade. Japan had been a closed society since the 1600s. So Japan had recognized early on that Western influence could maybe be harmful or at least change their culture that they already had. And so the government closed off their society. They only allowed a little bit of trade. And in 1856, the U.S. sent the Admiral Matthew Perry to Japan to force them to open. And so he pretty much carried a letter from the President of the United States pretty much saying, you need to open to trade or we're going to attack you. And so Japan opened to trade and underwent a lot of changes in westernization. And then Southeast Asia continued to be colonized by Britain, France, the Dutch, and the United States. And we'll look at that in a moment. So if you look at this map, you can see the kind of beige-ish yellow area is the Dutch. So they controlled most of what is today Indonesia. The United States controlled the Philippines. French Indochina is the name, it's kind of bluish purple here, is the name for the major French colony, which today includes the countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And you can see places like China stayed independent, but we know that really they were becoming very much economically intertwined with Europe at this time. So here's another political cartoon, and you can see in the middle we have China. So go ahead and examine this and discuss together which of the kind of key terms or events that I went over do you think is best represented or associated with this cartoon. Also, see if you can identify some of the countries, European countries, that are represented here. All right, so here is some information that I'm pretty sure you would not have learned about in another class, the debate over imperialism. So although a lot of people were in favor of imperialism in the late 19th century in Europe, there definitely were two sides to the argument. So advocates for imperialism first. The Pan-German League is a major advocate for imperialism. They were ultra-nationalist, so they feel very strongly about German heritage and unifying Germany. They're a radical right-wing group, and they thought that imperialism would be a good way to unite behind a common cause. So in the time period leading up to German unification, they viewed this as a possible way or method to bring the German people together behind the idea of Germany as an actual place. All right, opponents to imperialism. Otto von Bismarck, believed that colonies were not very important, but recognized that they were important to the German people. So to me, this goes back to realpolitik, which we talked about with Bismarck before. He does not think that colonies are really that important. I mean, they're very expensive. It takes a lot of effort to maintain this huge empire, but he recognizes that to the people of Europe, they see colonies as very important as a show of national power. And so he kind of goes along with the establishment of these African colonies, even though to him it's not worth much. Another person who is very anti-imperialist is Vladimir Lenin. So Vladimir Lenin, you'll remember from the Russian Revolution, which we haven't studied yet in this class, but I know you've learned about it in the past. He wrote that imperialism is a direct effect of the evils of capitalism. So take a minute and pause the video and you can discuss this question together. What connection is there between capitalism and imperialism? So think about the economics of the situation. And how does that help explain why somebody who's Marxist could be against it? Another topic that I think is unique to European history is the influence on the arts of imperialism. So Asian art and different Asian products like things for the home, china, and furniture and things like that had become popular in Europe since the time of European exploration starting. But during this time in the 19th century, we also see a huge impact of Asian and African art on the visual arts of Europe. So an example that we'll look at is the influence of Japanese woodblock prints on Vincent van Gogh. So a lot of these artists, the idea here is that for the first time, they have a lot of access to examples and information about Asian and African art. It just becomes much more widespread in Europe, and so artists have access to it. People like Van Gogh, he collected Japanese prints and even made his own copies of them, kind of modeling himself after their style, and we'll look at some examples. So here's an example of a Japanese print on the left, and then Van Gogh's copy on the right. So you can kind of see, I mean, it does look very similar, but you can also, I think, see some elements of Van Gogh's Impressionism in the brushstrokes and things like that. Another really famous artwork by Van Gogh is the cherry blossoms, which is a common theme in Japanese artwork. And so this is his rendering of the Japanese cherry trees. And here's one more example of a Japanese woodblock print on the left, and then Van Gogh's copy of it on the right. And then these are examples of artworks he created on his own in the style of the Japanese and with this similar subject matter to what the Japanese did. Another important artist who is very heavily influenced by Asian art is Paul Gauguin. So he was a French post-impressionist. He traveled to Tahiti in the 1890s and made several trips there, and he spent a lot of time living there, and he was very influenced by the people of Tahiti who are represented in his artwork, and we'll look at some of the kind of social commentary that he makes on European actions through his artwork. So Gauguin did a lot of portraits of the Tahitian people, and art historians generally feel like Gauguin portrays the Tahitian people as a very proud people in a respectful manner generally. So sometimes artwork or literature or things like that from this time period depict non-European peoples more as like savage type people, and that's not necessarily really reflected as much in Gauguin's work. Here's a really famous one called Barbaric Tales by Paul Gauguin. So we have in the front here 2 Tahitian women, and they're depicted as mostly nude, so we can think about that and what that represents. And then in the background, we have a European. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video and discuss this. So think about the title and how that relates to the artwork, Barbaric Tales. Who in this image looks barbaric to you? And what do you think Gauguin is trying to say? Here we have another artwork from Gauguin. Where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? And this artwork kind of tells the tale of people through a life story. So it's meant to be viewed in some ways from right to left. So on the right, we have a young child. Kind of pan through each little scene as you move to the left till we go to the left side where we have an old man. And then the last artist we'll look at is Pablo Picasso. So Picasso, I'm sure even though we haven't even gone over it yet, a lot of you know, is associated with Cubism. He was very heavily influenced by African art in the early 1900s, and especially by African masks. So Cubism represents people and objects through geometric shapes. And so Pablo Picasso is really taking the African masks that he sees coming and being imported from Africa and using that kind of as a basis of his Cubism. And I think that'll be evident as you look at the images. On the right, we have an African mask, and look at the exaggeration, the angular lines, and how that's represented in the painting of the human form by Picasso on the left. And here are some more examples. Again, hopefully you can see how he was influenced by the masks from Africa in the way that he depicted, especially the human face in his early Cubist art. Another topic that you're supposed to understand is how these non-native people responded to Europeans coming. And so I'm going to go over them relatively quickly. Again, I don't think you need to know a ton of detail about any of these things because we are obviously mostly focused on what Europeans are doing. But it would be good to have some examples from each region, so that's what I'm going to go over. So China's Boxer Rebellion is a good example. To summarize the Boxer Rebellion, it's a backlash against European culture, especially Christianity. So the Boxers were members of a secret society in China, and they practiced martial arts, which they felt gave them special spiritual powers and made them impervious to weapons from the Europeans, even like bullets. The Boxers were especially upset that China was allowing all these foreigners to come in, and especially Christian missionaries. And so they saw Christian missionaries as a real symbol of the encroachment of European culture. And so in the year 1900, the Boxers roamed around China, killing any Christian missionaries they came into contact with, as well as Chinese people who had already converted to Christianity. Now, in order to keep trade going and stop this instability in China, Western governments quickly came in and sent their militaries in to crush the Boxer Rebellion. But it's a good example of the fact that not everybody in China just willingly went along with all these foreigners coming in. Here's another political cartoon you all can discuss. So discuss what's happening here, what does it represent, and see if you can figure out who the different people are or what countries they represent. Another example of a response to imperialism is Japan's Meiji Restoration. So earlier I told you that Japan was forcibly opened by the United States in the mid-1800s. Japan took a different route than a lot of these other countries. So in response, they fully, in a lot of ways, westernized and rapidly industrialized. So the Meiji Restoration includes the restoration of the emperor to power. Before that, they had a military leader. The government sponsored rapid industrialization. They adopted and welcomed European technology and Western culture. So if you look at these images, I think it really depicts that. These are images from Japanese factories, and other than who's actually in the images, I mean, I think they look very similar to images we see of the Industrial Revolution in places like Britain, even down to the type of work they're doing. Notice that there are a lot of women and children in these images. And so Japan definitely embraced Westernization and industrialization in response to Europeans coming. These are some prints from Japan during the Meiji Restoration, and if you'd like to, you could pause and discuss these and just look at all the Western influence that you see in these images. The next one is India, and we already talked about the Sepoy Mutiny, so I'm not going to go over that again. Another example of a response is the Indian National Congress. This was formed in 1885, and initially the Indian National Congress worked to just get a share of governance. So they really wanted representation for at least some Indians, like maybe upper class Indians, in the British government. Over time, as that did not really happen, and the British really did not make meaningful changes for the Indians, they pushed for independence. And so they're one of the major groups involved in Indian independence. Gandhi, for example, worked very closely a lot of times with the Indian National Congress. And then the last example is the Zulu resistance. So the Zulu were an African group who came in contact with Europeans as the British kind of pushed the Dutch, who are called the Boers, out of South Africa. Basically what you need to know is there were several armed conflicts between the Zulus and the Europeans, and this is called the Anglo-Zulu War. The British ordered that the Zulus be disarmed so they would stop attacking the colony of South Africa, and it resulted in several bloody battles between Zulu and British. There actually are examples of the Zulu being really successful in some of these battles, even though they were outmatched in terms of their weaponry, but ultimately they were crushed by the British and taken over. So to summarize all of these, we see people, the key thing is we see people responding in very different ways. Okay, so the Boxer Rebellion is a more violent backlash against European culture. Japan, in a lot of ways, embraced Western culture and industrialization. The Indians, the Sepoy Rebellion, so again, violent reactions, but also negotiation with the Indian National Congress and trying to make change politically. And then the Zulu resistance, sometimes it resulted in outright war between the colonial people and the Europeans. So what are the overall positives and negatives? Well, European medicine and nutrition led to increased population in a lot of these places and longer life expectancy. Most of these parts of the world received new technology, especially things that focused on communication, and transportation. And that's definitely twofold. I mean, I think it is a positive to have better communication within a country. But at the same time, Europeans are setting these systems up because it allows them to exert more control over the colonies. And then a small minority of indigenous people received education and positions in the government. And we talked about that, how a lot of times they took the upper class people from the colony and gave them an education so that they could work in the government for the colonial power. Negative impacts. Europeans imposed all of their own culture onto these people, and so a lot of indigenous culture was lost. So it's not as if people in Asia and Africa did not already have their own language and religion and government and economy and all of that, but Europeans imposed their vision of those things on these people. Social Darwinism and racism was common, and so this, in a lot of cases, led to very harsh treatment of the native people. The effects of the Berlin Conference, especially, are still felt in Africa today. So some of the conflicts, genocides and things like that from the late 20th century and even now in the 21st century can be traced back to the way that the colonial people were treated, the way that they were grouped together, and the way that the boundaries of Africa were drawn pretty artificially. And then lastly is economic imperialism. So because Europeans focused on extracting raw materials from the colonies and not developing manufacturing, and in some cases taking steps to really discourage manufacturing in these colonies, even when they became independent in the 20th century, a lot of these parts of the world have struggled economically because they're still dependent on others for their manufactured products. So that's the end of this PowerPoint, and I'll see you on the next one.